This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, and B. Lupita. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and this week we are going to complete our trio of Canaanite goddesses and start talking about the third of this group, which we started with Astarte, and Asherah was what we covered last week, or the last podcast, and now we are going to look at Anath or Anath. And this is usually spelled A-N-A-T or sometimes A-N-A-T-H. And the epithet of this particular goddess is maiden. It's spelled, there's a sort of cuneiformic equivalent that we usually transliterate as B-T-L-T, which I do not know how to pronounce, but that is translated often as maiden. And Anath is actually a warrior goddess. And she is often, she's got some other attributes that have been listed as being questionable. So, for instance, she's also sometimes seen as a fertility goddess. She is also seen as a hunting goddess. And she is sometimes interpreted as the wife of Ba'al, the Canaanite Ba'al. But she's interpreted in this cycle as the wife of Ba'al. Ba'al Hadad, probably the one that they're referring to here, because that Ba'al itself, as we're going to discuss, is really just a title that means Lord. But it's used to often describe a variety of different gods, and has a different meaning in the Old Testament as well. But Anath is sometimes seen as the wife of Ba'al, although there's really no evidence in the text that Anath is Baal's wife. There's no reproduction there. She doesn't seem to be producing any children or anything like that. In fact, the idea of maiden almost implies a virginity, similar kind of virginity that we see in goddesses like Athena and Artemis. And in fact, there is said to be a connection between Athena and Anath. How strong we can go from that she can be compared to Athena, to those like Barbara Walker saying that she actually that Athena is actually the Greek version of Anath, which I don't like. A lot of things Barbara Walker says. She does have some interesting theories. I don't know how much we can rely on them at face value. I feel like she tries to do what Fraser did with the Golden Bough, or what Jane Harrison, or what even Joseph Campbell to some degree try to do, where they try to take all these figures that they think are similar enough and mash them together and say, oh, they're really the same thing. So I take anything. So I am going to actually read something from Barbara Walker's Encyclopedia of Women's Secrets, which is an interesting book, but there is a lot of inaccuracy in it. So there's some interesting ideas that you need to take with a grain of salt, but I think there is some relevance to her entry on Anath here. Now, the other aspect of Anath with respect to Ba'al is that she is his sister. Now, again, I don't know that there's anything that explicitly says that, but Ba'al himself this particular Ba'al is said to either be a son of Dagon or a son of El. We've seen El many, many times here. El is, in the Israelite religion, ends up being, at least his characteristics are morphed into the god Yahweh, which is why Yahweh becomes something of a fertility god plus a storm god. In other parts of the world, El ends up being superseded by Ba'al, and Ba'al is regarded almost as a son in this respect. Certainly within the Ba'al cycle, we see that implication. So what I think is safe to say about Anath is that she is a helpmate. Helpmate is a good term to describe her with respect to Baal. Whether she is in fact his sister, or whether she is in fact his wife, or both, or neither, she definitely is somebody who has his back in the stories of the Baal cycle. And it's those stories that I think are going to be of interest to us today when we talk about what she does and what her role is. There's quite a bit to compare her to, because she has characteristics of, as I've said, of Athena. She has characteristics of Artemis, who would obviously are later deities that would be connected with her. I mean, there may have been some of those deities did exist, certainly when we look at the Linear A and Linear B tablets. Linear B, we can't really translate Linear A. Linear B tablets, they certainly make references to goddesses like Athena in particular, and Artemis, although they may have had different functions at that time. So my point being is that they may have been contemporary, the time period that we associate her with. We see something is back. I've seen discussions back as far as the 3rd millennium BCE, which is roughly the 2000s BCE. But we do see statuary of her that was shown from roughly the Bronze Age. So we're saying 1400 to 1200 BCE. So she's very old. These religions are very old. These gods are very old, and they've been around. The references to Anath in the Bible are sporadic and tend to be more in the way of being explanatory names rather than an actual reference to her as a goddess. So it's not, a lot of people don't seem to feel that the Israelites actually worshiped Anath, but she is mentioned in certain contexts, particularly when we talk about the word anathema. If we hear that something is anathema, it is a reference to Anath, and we will talk about what that means. Normally, if something's anathema, it's just it's repulsed. It's right out. It's you get rid of it. It's not. It's really, it has to do with something that's cursed, and so Anath herself has this very, very volatile association. So I'm going to read a little bit from actually encyclopedia.com, which is not my favorite source, but their summary here is a little clearer than some of the other ones that get very heavily into the semantics and the differences between texts and so forth, which are interesting and can be useful, but I think are probably too detailed for this podcast. So I'm just going to look at this entry, which I feel summarizes the important stuff. So it says, the maiden Anath is a West Semitic or Canaanite warrior goddess known for her violent temperament and volatile emotions. Although her name and cult are attested from the late 3rd millennium BCE to the 4th century BCE, Anath plays a prominent role only in the late Bronze Age mythological texts from the Syrian city of Ugarit. These poetic narratives, written in an alphabetic cuneiform script, depict Anath as a fierce and impetuous goddess who delights in bloodshed. As a hunter and protector of wild animals, Anath also functions as a mistress of animals in Canaanite tradition. Anath's primary epithet in Ugaritic sources is that BTLT, which means maiden, which identifies her as an adolescent female, a girl of marriageable age. Okay, there's something else to be said, too, about the idea of the adolescent. There's a very strong connection between adolescent girls and the goddess Artemis. A lot of Greek rituals are about appeasing the wrath of Artemis. Because when a girl is reaching that age, at that age of puberty where she is capable of reproduction, okay, whether you consider that desirable or not, that she's reached that age of reproduction, and she's heading into the period of her life where she is going to lose her virginity and become a mother, presumably. Imagine there's cases where maybe that doesn't happen, but the idea is that these rituals were there to overcome the anger of Artemis, who is, as we see in Greek myth, is infuriated when she has girls who are quote unquote dedicated to her, and they break vows of chastity, and they end up, whether intentionally or not. I mean, it could be that they were ravished by someone, and it doesn't matter if they end up pregnant. Then Artemis still wreaks a very, very severe sentence upon those who break that vow of chastity. So in a sense, there's this idea that a girl reaching marriageable age runs the risk of angering Artemis by, quote-unquote, breaking that vow of chastity. I do talk about this in one of my very early podcasts. I think it's the one on the Hanging Virgins, that addresses this, and it is something that's addressed in detail in Sarah Iles Johnston's book, The Restless Dead. There's an entire chapter on it, really, or entire section. So I'm not going to go over that again. However, I think the fact that Anath is represented as this virgin, like almost adolescent type goddess, there's an implied lack of sexuality there, like that she is virginal, as we see with the huntress goddesses and their associations. So I feel there that we're going to learn about the mythology of Anath may be connected to this idea of having to pass the wrath of the virgin goddess, as it were, or the role that the virgin goddess actually does play in fertility, which is a little different here. I'm not going to say that they're the same, but there are some interesting connections between Artemis, between the underworld, between fertility of women and the idea of her being an adolescent woman, which is quite interesting. Okay, so it says she is called the loveliest of the sisters of Baal. Okay, so there's allegedly sources that whether they're translating that as sister accurately or not. Apparently there is some debate about that, but okay, we'll just go with sister / helpmate. Anath is also a player of the lyre and singer of love songs in Ugaritic narrative. Okay, so that's interesting. Although female, the adolescent goddess engages in the traditionally masculine pursuits of warfare, hunting, and political intrigue. Okay, as I've said before, war is actually a very feminine thing. We always associate war with masculinity, but as we are seeing more and more in these goddesses, particularly these Levantine goddesses, they are, this is the region of Mesopotamia that we're talking about, known as the Levant. There definitely is a warlike attribute to the love goddesses, and there is a potential fertility connection or love connection in the chaste goddesses, vice versa. It's not as clear cut as, oh, this one's a virgin and this one represents sex. I mean, they're all tied together in some fashion, even though I wouldn't go as far as to say that Anath is a love goddess in the sense that Aphrodite might be, or is entirely a virgin goddess in the sense that Athena might be. There's some nuance here, and if we know anything about the dark goddesses of this period, is that they are extraordinarily complex. Even the goddesses that are alleged to be the goddesses of light and civilization, they are also very, very complex. They're not. We tend to think of them in terms of whether or not they are good or bad, whether their attributes are benefic or malevolent. And as you'll see, they're both neither and all. There's that liminality there. They're both and they're also not that. So it's very complex when we're dealing with this. But so we always have to bear that in mind when they talk about characteristics of a goddess that they believe is associated with one thing, in this case war, and then see that she also has characteristics associated with love or sex or fertility, and they say, that doesn't seem right. Maybe she's being conflated with another goddess. Well, no, it's not necessarily an uncommon attribute of war goddesses. And I think by the time we get to the end of this session or this podcast, I think we'll see a little bit more of why that might be. What that connection might be to Earth Mothers and fertility rituals and so forth. Okay. It says, earlier studies often assume that Anath is Baal's consort. More recent studies by Peggy Day and Neil Walls, however, argue that the extant Ugaritic texts never depict her as sexually active. While some scholars have erroneously identified Anath with the cow that mates with and bears an heir for Baal, sounds like there's a similar Greek myth to that, the Ugaritic narratives clearly distinguish between Anath and Baal's cow. As his devoted sister, Anath actively supports Baal's quest for kingship among the gods. She serves as a diplomatic intermediary in securing the support of El, her elderly father, for the establishment of his royal palace. Of course, she does so in an extremely violent way. The warrior Anath boasts of having vanquished many of Baal's foes, including Yam, the Canaanite primordial sea, the twisting serpent, and the seven-headed dragon. Whether or not Anath is the consort of Baal, the maiden goddess maintains her autonomy and independence from male control. She lives in her own palace on her sacred mountain. There's a connection with Anath with Sappho. This is giving a different name. It's spelled INBB, but there have been various names of these mountains, and this may be referring to a slightly different one, although there is a temple of Baal and Anath supposedly on this Mount Sappho, which is now has a different name. I think it's called Jebel Akra, I think is the current name of the mountain. But in any case, she lives in her own palace rather than in the household of her father, brother, or consort. Ugaritic poetry venerates Anat as the mistress of kingship, the mistress of dominion, and the mistress of the high heavens. So she definitely has this celestial role, although we see that she also has a Chtonic connection as well. The meaning of her epithet, there's one that I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. There's one that remains uncertain, but it might most likely refers to her position within the pantheon's kinship structure. That epithet is spelled YBMT is the first word. The second one is like lim, Limm. So they don't know exactly what that means. Anat displays her malevolent aggression in 2 encounters with El, in which she threatens to drag him from his throne to the ground like a lamb for slaughter. Oh, that's interesting. Lamb for slaughter. We've seen that theme repeated in the Bible. She promises to smash his skull and to make his gray hair run with blood and his gray beard with gore unless he agrees to her demands. Now, there's 2 different outcomes to this in different places. In one it seems that he refuses her request, and this is when she needs to send Asherah in to petition on Baal's behalf instead, because she is seen as being rude, to put it mildly. It says, El's response to his belligerent daughter seems more indulgent than fearful. I know, my daughter, that you are incorrigible and that among the goddesses there is no rancor like yours. That's the translation. While El apparently denies her request in one text, the other he yields to her rash demands. Depart, my daughter, haughty is your heart. Take what is in your mind, carry out what is in your breast. Whoever hinders you will be destroyed. And it says El's words are perhaps reflected in 8th century Akkadian text that praises Anat, whose heroism among the goddesses has no equal. So she's taking certainly a very direct and not very diplomatic approach here if we're trying to compare her to Athena. But although there are other instances in which Anat does try to engage in diplomacy, particularly when she's dealing with the god Mot of the underworld, a god who's associated with barrenness. And that's a pretty substantial myth that we're going to talk about. But let's move on here with this particular entry. Another famous scene from Ugaritic myth depicts Anat's bloodthirsty nature as she gleefully slaughters armies of human warriors. Now, this has also been talked about as human sacrifices that are made to Anat. Delighting in the carnage of battle, and also apparently at least in some versions, the delight of these sacrifices of men, whether these men are prisoners of war or not or whatever, that's not really clear to me. But she wades in their blood up to her thighs. She adorns herself by placing her enemies' severed heads on a garland around her neck and their severed hands on a belt around her waist before she exultantly wades into the gore of battle a second time. And they're saying this is possibly a description of ritual cannibalism. Grisly scene portrays the murderous quality of Anat's martial enthusiasm. Now, this certainly sounds like another goddess that we've all pretty familiar with, whether we are familiar with Hinduism or not, and that, of course, is goddess Kali, who also wears a garland of heads and wears severed limbs. In another version, I believe Barbara Walker talks about her as she has an apron around which is strung with the male members that she has cut off, just to use that term instead of the other. And so, because apparently castration of the death god is also part of her mythos and a part of what she does, which we'll, again, get to when we get to that part of the myth. So there's bloodshed of male warriors to the goddess Anat. So it says, in contrast with her warlike attributes, Anat is also portrayed in Ugaritic myth as a compassionate goddess who pathetically grieves the death of her brother. Like the heart of a cow for its calf, like the heart of a ewe for its lamb, such is the heart of Anat for Baal. On hearing of his death, Anat scours the earth in search of her slain brother's corpse, which she then buries with elaborate funerary sacrifices and mourning rites. Anat gnashes her cheeks and her chin in a heartfelt display of ritual bloodletting. She gashes them, sorry. I thought there was an N there. She gashes them. So she cuts herself. She then humbly entreats Mot, the Ugaritic god of death, to return her brother to her. After her diplomatic efforts have failed, however, Anat reverts to her more characteristic mode and viciously attacks Mot. She seizes divine Mot. With a blade she splits him, with a sieve she winnows him, with fire she burns him, and with millstones she grinds him. Okay, that's a phrasing that's important to think about. Anath scatters his pulverized remains in a field for the birds to consume. The scene of utter annihilation demonstrates Anath's impulsive ferocity, but also leads to Baal's restoration as ruler of the earth. Yeah, so they're basically saying that it's very clear that this definitely has to do with death and rebirth. Because as it's noted elsewhere, in this particular area, there were summers that were barren, hot and barren. So it was dry like a desert. And it was the rains of autumn that came and brought new growth, which is a little different. We expect death to be associated with autumn, not summer. But herein also, we see an attribute of something that we see in Egypt. Now, Egypt is different because Egypt is flooded by the river Nile and the different rivers. It's the flooding of those rivers that brings the fertility to the region. Here, that's not the case. It is the rains that come and that allow for things to grow, allow for fertility of the earth to progress. So what we see here is we see this idea of the underworld god, Mot, as representing this barren period, this period of barrenness in the summer, which by releasing Baal from the underworld, as Baal is the one who is a storm god, and he brings the restorative rains. He's associated with the thunderbolt. We've talked about the thunderbolt in association with Zeus, in association with Yahweh, in association with Indra, and in association with Lu in the Celtic. And all of them had this similar role of striking their thunderbolt, bringing their storm in order to restore life. The Indra myth is interesting too, because he attacks the serpent Vritra, who is basically holding up the world ocean and also causing a drought. He drops his thunderbolt on him, destroys him, and then the waters flow again. Joseph Campbell talked about this as kind of a reverse flood myth. Like, instead of the earth dying from too much water, it's dying from not enough water. And so we have this idea of the storm god as bringing the life-giving rains, which is a pretty obvious connection and connotation, I would think. And depending on the region, that alters the mythic narrative to some degree as to what actually happens. Now, let me just read some of these other myths of Anath, and then I want to return to that one because I think that one's pretty important. Anath's passionate disposition takes on a more sinister quality in the Ugaritic epic of Akkad, in a scene that is perhaps related to the Hellenistic accounts of Artemis and the Babylonian account of Ishtar's failed seduction of Gilgamesh. Anath attempts to wrest a divinely crafted bow from the young hero Akkad. He disdains her offer of gold, silver, and immortality in exchange for the composite bow, and insolently informs her that females are not meant to be warriors. That's a bad move, Akkad. Anyway, seeking revenge for the insult, Anath eventually has her henchmen murder Akkad. The bow, however, is lost, and Anath tearfully regrets her impulsive actions in killing the young man, an injustice that causes drought and famine in the land. And the conclusion to this epic has yet to be recovered. So we often wonder if this is why she has a role with Baal in relieving drought and famine as part of her mythology. Now, Anath's also an Egyptian goddess, and as it mentions here, she's introduced during the Hyksos period, which is the second intermediate period, they're saying about 1650 to 1550 BCE, and this is when Egypt was taken over by foreign rulers for a period of time. And although even when those rulers left, Anath ended up remaining as an Egyptian goddess, especially during the eras of the Ramesses pharaohships. And she was still a patron goddess of the Ramesses, and she was mistress of the heavens, a martial goddess who gives victory in battle. So she has entirely a war association in Egypt. Aramaic texts from the 5th century BCE Jewish community in Elephantine Egypt refer to Anath Bethel and Anath Yahu, in which some scholars interpret as references to the goddess Anath as the consort of the gods Bethel and Yahweh, respectively. Well, I think that's been pretty much debunked. I don't think that's the way it's interpreted at this point, because we don't see anywhere in the text. Asherah is often referred to as a potential wife of Yahweh, unless the two are being conflated, which is another theory. But again, that theory has also been debunked because there has been this tendency in old scholarship to just take all of the particular female deities of the of an area and just put them all together and say, oh yeah, they're all pretty much the same goddess. But that's clearly is not the case. So it says other scholars translate this word nt, which they which they're interpreting as Anath, as providence or sign, and understand it as the cultic hypostasis of the male deity rather than the appearance of Anath in Jewish literature. Anath Bethel also appears in the list of divine witnesses to the 7th century Assyrian treaty between King Baal of Tyre and Esarhaddon. Hellenistic sources sometimes equate Anath with the virgin warrior Athena, as in a 4th century BCE bilingual inscription in Phoenician and Greek from Lapithos on Cyprus. Later translation identify Anath with other Canaanite goddesses such as Astarte and Atargatis Derketo. So yeah, as we see with some of these very ancient deities, they have qualities that may be subsumed into the mythologies and into the deities of their neighbors. Now, in Egypt, now this is looking at ancient Egypt online, they say she's a goddess of fertility, sexual love, hunting, and war. But she was sometimes known as the wanton because of her lust for sex and war. Well, again, that's given her virginal nature. I don't know if it's different in Egypt. She was the fairest daughter, sister of Baal, the lady, the destroyer, the strength of life, and the lady of the mountain. She had a number of epithets which seem to have been peculiarly Egyptian, most notably Anat-her, agreeable Anat, Heret Anata, terror of Anat, and around Elephantine, Bethel, or the house of God. And Bethel is, so this is interesting because the term house of God is the one we associate in the tarot deck with the tower, with the falling tower that's hit by lightning and that crashes to the ground. Something actually I think that might be appropriate to Anat in her symbolism. So they're saying in here that this is the cuneiform text described her as an aggressive and ruthless goddess who destroys the enemies of Baal and wades through their pools of their blood. She hunts down and kills Mot when he slays Baal. However, she also has a gentler side. As a goddess of sexuality, she was considered to be the most beautiful of all the gods, and as fertility goddess, protected people, animal, and crops. Okay, well, presumably this is in Egypt. They're not really citing where this comes from. Now, they're saying here she was originally a daughter of El and the sister and wife of Baal. So yeah, if Baal is considered to be in some texts the son of El, in which he isn't always, but again, as I've mentioned, there's multiple Baals. Baal is, again, a term for Lord, in the same way that at least one source says that the Canaanite Baal is actually Ba'al Hadad, and that Hadad became such a sacred name because that fertility was so important to their survival, that just in the way that you will find that Jewish people will not speak the name of Yahweh because it's too holy, there will be another epithet that they use instead. So it said that Baal was used instead of saying Hadad, and just as with Yahweh, you will use the term Adonai instead of Yahweh to refer to that same God, like the Most High. Now, in Egypt, it says she was regarded as the daughter of Ra, the sun god, and the wife of Set. Now, we've seen another wife of Set, Tawaret, the hippopotamus goddess. And Set here was associated with Baal, because Seth makes sense, because Seth is the bringer of storms. Although in Egypt iconography, he tends to have a more negative connotation than he would in the area where the storms and the rain were something that actually brought fertility. That there wasn't that association in Egypt necessarily, because again, it was the flooding of the rivers that brought fertility. It says in Memphis, she was thought to be the daughter of Ptah. The Hebrew workers of the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom considered her to be the wife of Enjedi, who is also associated with Osiris. There's some connections between those myths, and the way in which she destroys, scatters, and grinds up the god Mot has sometimes been compared to what Seth does to Osiris in the most common myth about the enmity between the two brothers when Seth wants to win the kingship away from him and then tricks him into getting into the sarcophagus, then cuts him into pieces and gets rid of it. So this says the Egyptians also linked her with Neith, a war goddess from the Delta who was associated with weaving, which again, you see the Athena associations there. Like Neith, Anat was often depicted as bearing either a spear or a spindle. She was also associated with the precious dye known as Tyrian purple, which despite the name was sometimes almost blood red in color, and the Murex snail from which the dye was made. So she was worshipped in Memphis with all the major gods and goddesses, but also had shrines in Tanis, which is the Hyksos capital, and Beth Shan in Palestine. She was also worshipped in the Temple of Yahweh by the Jewish settlers on the island of Elephantine. Okay, so this seems to be unique because we don't see Anat generally worshipped in the way that we might hear about about Asherah poles being present in the temple of Yahweh. This seems to be unique to that area. It says the Phoenicians depicted Anath as a naked woman with exaggerated sexual organs bearing a bow and arrow, sometimes exchanged for a spear or weaving spindle. She was often accompanied by a lion, her sacred animal. In Egypt, she was frequently given a plumed crown which represented the white crown and carried either a spear, battle axe, and a shield, or a scepter and an ankh. Now, this Phoenician Anath, is probably connected to, there's a idea of the Phoenician, this Phoenician interpretation of these stories, especially with respect to Baal. Baal is actually associated with El in the Phoenician. And if you recall, or maybe you don't, but there's the story of Jezebel in the Old Testament, in which Jezebel comes and she brings with her worship of Baal to the Israelites, which becomes a problem because this is in direct conflict with their worship of Yahweh, and Yahweh, of course, doesn't, as we've said, does not like to have other gods before him. However, interestingly, the Canaanite Baal is considered to be, certainly, if not the successor of El, is also sometimes identified with El. Just as Yahweh, whether you want to say Yahweh is identified with El, certainly the name El does appear in the Bible many, many times to refer to Yahweh. But at the very least, we will say that El is, and his characteristics are certainly subsumed into Yahweh. So really, in a sense, you are talking about the same deity with different names, but also different forms of worship as well, at least at some level. But by the time the Israelites have done their own version of worshiping Yahweh, their own, whatever those own rules, commandments, covenants, whatever they are, they don't match what the Phoenician one was. Well, though it's interesting because on some level they are talking about the same deity. Okay, so we don't see Anath really represented in the Bible, but there is a really interesting. I just want to see if there's, before I get into that, I want to just see if there's other things that are said about her. I'm just looking through this other, much more complex Wikipedia entry, which actually has all of the linguistics in here. We've talked about her in the Baal cycle. It says El summons her to perform a ritual whose precise character is uncertain, but which, according to John Gibson, might have been meant to prevent her from actively supporting Baal. Later, when Yam, Baal's rival for the position of king of the gods, sends his messengers to divine assembly, Anath and Ashtart prevent Baal from harming them. She seizes his right hand, while the other goddess seizes his left hand. So again, in some of these versions, it's said that Ashtart or Astarte and Anath are basically seen as worshipped in a pair. That one being more of the love fertility aspect and perhaps the other being the more warlike aspect. I don't know. We do see them represented in a pair. Whether or not they're actually seen as a pair all the time is also not clear here. But it is one of the things that people have observed. She says, Anath also appears in the section of the story focused on Baal striving to be granted permission to have a palace built for himself. And yeah, that's the episode we talk about with El, where she apparently confronts a human army in a passage that remains poorly understood. They says, afterwards, the messengers of Baal, Gapnu, or Gupan, and Ugar approach her, which makes her worried if a new enemy is challenging Baal's authority, prompting her to recall battles she took part in previously. And this is where she lists all the ones that she has, all these adversaries that she's defeated. It says, after learning that the source of Baal's anguish is not a new enemy, but the lack of his own dwelling, she disrespectfully attempts to pressure El to grant Baal. That's putting it mildly. And at least in one version, she fails. In other versions, she succeeds. Subsequently, she gets Atharat to act as a mediator on his behalf. So she manages to get her to get the permission for Baal to have his palace, and then she seemingly joins Atharat and her servant in their journey to El's dwelling. So again, it seems to be that at least one of the two in different versions manages to get Baal his palace. It says after his death at the hands of Mot, meaning Baal's death, Anath mourns him. She also shows concern about the fate of the people. Shapash, the sun goddess, is the first to notice her despair and helps her bring the deceased weather god to Mount Saphon for his burial. Yeah, and that's the mountain that's considered, sometimes it's sacred to Anath and Baal, other times to all gods, depending. Afterwards, she announces Baal's death to El, who decides it's necessary to appoint a substitute king. So then there's some things that say that she's actually, because then we see that Baal has returned, so this person is surmising, well, maybe she buried a substitute. But as we have seen, her destruction of the death god, Mot, actually is what allows Baal to return. So it is a kind of death and resurrection myth. Okay, yeah, let's see. The only other story that we see connected with her is that her and Astarte and Ashtart or Astarte are referenced in the final lines of a particular tablet where they're trying to, it says that during a banquet organized by El, Yarick, who in this composition behaves like a dog, possibly due to engaging in alcohol consumption, receives a piece of meat from her and Ashtart. The goddesses are subsequently rebuked by a nameless servant of El, who complains that they offer choice cuts of meat to a dog. And at least one interpretation of this passage, and I'm not really quite sure how we get there, at least from this explanation, is that they are actually looking for, that El is actually hungover himself, and that they are looking for a hangover cure for him. There's that as well. Okay, so we have these different attestations. We've gone into some of these other myths and sources. These are probably a little bit more minor. The Phoenician sources here are a little bit interesting. It says that they're talking about the similarity between Anath and Athena by modern researchers, including Walter Burkert, who is one of the most famous researchers of Greek religion, who highlighted the similarities in iconography of martial deities excavated in Greece, especially statuettes. Goddess referred to as Athena by Philo of Byblos has been argued to be Anath. Philo states that Athena's sister was Persephone, who might simply be the Greek goddess in this case, as she was worshipped in Samaria. So the connection cannot be with the Ugaritic Arse cannot be proven. However, probably what's going on there, okay, I think the idea of connecting her with Persephone, it might be the connection between the myth of Baal, Mot, and Anath, and the way in which that has to do with the refreshing of the earth, like going from the barren period, which we tend to think of as winter to spring. But in this particular region where Anath's worshipped, it's actually going from summer to autumn. We have this idea of a deity going into the underworld, and when they go there, then the earth is not fertile. This is what we see with the Persephone or Proserpina myth, that when she's abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld, and her mother goes searching for her. In her grief, her mother, who is the one who guarantees the fertility of the land, she's an agriculture goddess, she basically makes the earth barren. So that's when Zeus has to negotiate with Hades that for Persephone to come up for part of the year, because when she comes up, then her mother is happy again and brings life to the earth. Now in this myth, we have Anath going into the underworld to retrieve Baal and to negotiate with Mot to bring him back. But when this negotiation fails, she then kills Mot in a manner that, if you recall the way we described it, is almost what you do when you're grinding up something to make wheat flour or to make bread. He's actually ground into a form that one then might use, and then he's burned with fire, right? So it's almost like she's baking him into bread, which sounds kind of weird, and then throwing the bread to the birds. And then in doing this and getting rid of Mot in this fashion, who is the god of barrenness. And again, Mot, in this particular sense, almost appears to be like grain. Like it's a piece of grain. You think of the John Barleycorn legends, right? So even within this barren deity, there are the seeds of life. And so there may be an implication there that in the barrenness of this death god, that life springs from the seeds of death. Now, I think at this point, I want to read a little bit from the Barbara Walker. Now, again, just a caveat as I'm reading this, please remember that Barbara Walker is something you need to take with a grain of salt. I'll try to do some interpretation as I go through about what seems to be reasonable and what is very clearly not, and we'll see. Okay, Anath is the twin of the goddess Mari as Lady of Birth and Death, worshipped by Canaanites, Amorites, Syrians, Egyptians, and Hebrews. Greek-speaking Phoenicians in Cyprus called her Anath, strength of life. Okay, problem already, because Mari is actually a male deity. There is not a female goddess, Mari. Mari is the name of actually a Babylonian city. And many of these texts, including the Baal cycle texts, have been found in this particular city. But Mari is assumed to be a male deity, not a female one, so strike one there. An Egyptian stele of the time of Ramesses II addresses her as Queen of Heaven and Mistress of all the gods. Under Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, she ruled both Egypt and Palestine. Semitic texts named her Virgin Daughter of Palestine or Virgin Wisdom dwelling in Zion. Okay, and her phrasing it this way is a way of trying to connect her to Athena as well. Jerusalem temple was occupied for centuries by both God, meaning El, and goddess, variously known as Queen of Heaven, Anath, Asherah, Mari, or Miriam. No, that's not correct. If anything, the only thing we know that occupied that temple would have been Asherah, because we hear about the Asherah poles in the Yahweh temples and how they later on became a problem. Her sanctuary, Beth Anat, House of Anat or House of God, is mentioned in the 19th chapter of Joshua. Some early Israelite chieftains called themselves her sons, like Shamar ben Anath, who slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad. Okay, so she talks about what she thinks the ox goad is, okay, and so on and so forth. Okay, primitive sacrificial rites of Anath or Anat were described in the Rosh Shamra texts. She was fertilized by the blood of men, not by their semen, because her worship dated all the way back to the Neolithic, when fatherhood was unknown and blood was considered to be the only substance that could transmit life. Okay, now that's interesting. That may or may not be true. It could be true. I'm not sure at what point it was that the male role in reproduction was understood. There certainly were some cultures that believed that the way that the woman was out by the full moon and the moonbeams got onto her. I don't know whether they got into her vaginal area, whether they just shone on her or whatever, but that somehow that this was where the babies came from. Certainly it was the idea that women could bear children and men could not. So in this case, men almost are assumed to have a quote-unquote barren role, and the blood itself is what's considered to be the source of life. I mean, blood certainly has a very strong Chtonic association. Blood sacrifice, the offering of blood, the necromantic rituals where blood was put out like we see in the Odyssey for the dead to drink from so that they could speak again. Blood was considered to be the life-giving source. So there is something to that. Hecatombs of men seem to have been sacrificed to Anat when her image was reddened with rouge and henna for the occasion. Violently she smites and gloats, Anat cuts them down, gazes, her liver exults in mirth. For she plunges her knees in the blood of the soldiers, her loins in the gore of the warriors, till she's had her fill of slaughtering in the house, cleaving among the tables. And she's saying that in similar rites in Egypt, priestesses hoisted up their skirts while dismembering the bull god Apis, so his spurting blood would bathe their loins and fertilize them. Yeah, and there does also to be a strong bull association here as well. So she's talking about the Mexican lady of the serpent skirt, which presumably is Coatzica, who made new life from I'm not going to say his name right. I was always told Quetzalcoatl, but that's not correct way to pronounce it. Anyway, that he made new life from his genital blood. Anat hung the shorn penises of her victims on her goatskin apron, or aegis. Now she does quote a source for this, having to do with Old Testament customs. There's a book on that. When the goddess was transplanted to Greece and permanently virginized as Athene, her aegis was transformed into the ceremonial apron of Libyan priestesses, from the ceremonial apron of Libyan priestesses into a breastplate. Athena still wore serpents, quote-unquote phalli, on her aegis, along with the gorgon head of her destroyer aspect. So Medusa's snakes, in other words, taking that phallic representation. Okay, and that again, I'm not really sure. I think for her to absolutely declare that Anath is the same as Athena is pushing it a little far. I mean, there could be a connection there. Certainly, in terms of aspects, they have a connection. But to say that the Greeks made Anat into Athene, I don't know that. I don't think we can say that. But we definitely again see these connections with Kali. You see this connection with, because immediately when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about the Aztec rituals. And the kind of blood sacrifices that went there. And so she's very much a goddess of death, dismemberment, and particularly castration, okay, which makes her certainly a very dark goddess indeed. Okay, now this is the interesting thing. It says, Anath annually cast her death curse, the anathema, on the Canaanite god who became lord of death, Maut, the castrated sterility aspect of the fertile Baal. Like Set in Egypt, Mot stood for the barren season that slew its own fertile twin, and she refers to the god Elaine. I didn't see a reference to that here. In the mythologies that I'm reading, it refers to Baal, but there could be something in that. So she's trying to say it's sacred king style, which again, that is also a myth that has been somewhat disproven, but she does make references to similar things like Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. So I am Elin, son of Baal, make ready then the sacrifice. I am the lamb which is made ready with pure wheat to be sacrificed in expiation. So what she's suggesting here is, like, we've looked at Dionysus as being a connection with the Jesus sacrifice, with the death and resurrection of Dionysus. She's suggesting that this death and resurrection of Baal, or this twin of Mot that she's calling Elaine, is actually the original reference story for that. But I can't say that for sure. I do know that the word anathema does actually appear in the Gospels, and she does mention this later. It says in the Christian Gospels, Anath's death curse, anathema, maranatha, in the 1 Corinthians 16:22, sometimes is very loosely translated, the bridegroom cometh. It really meant the bridegroom's imminent death. It was the solemn curse pronounced over any sacrificial victim. It carried the same double meaning as Latin sacer, meaning both holy and accursed, like all dying gods who were formerly anathemata offerings. Every nation has examples of gods chosen for the sacred marriage, then accursed and killed. Well, I don't think that's actually true, but yeah, that has been an idea that we've seen from some rather bad mythological sources. But nonetheless, there are some stories of that type. It says, Anath's capacity to curse and kill made even the Heavenly Father afraid of her. When El seemed reluctant to do her bidding, she threatened to smash his head and cover his gray hair and beard with gore. He hastily gave her everything she asked, saying, whoever hinders thee will be crushed. Okay, so that's at least in one version. But now she's actually saying that Anath was actually later connected to Saint Anne, which, again, that's interesting. I don't know about that. But in any case, but nonetheless, we have this idea of anathema. So let's go back, and I think this is the last thing I really want to say about this, and just talk about this, what they're calling the anathema, what they're calling this curse. And to declare something anathema, which she does talk about on the next page, she says, Christian term for a person or thing officially cursed and excommunicated. From the biblical passage, if any man love not the Lord Jesus Christ, let him be anathema maranatha. Originally, it was a curse pronounced by the goddess. She's conflating this with Mara or Mary on the dying god. So let's talk about this. So what we're saying here is that when Baal dies and she performs the funeral rites, she cuts herself. Now, mind you, in the act of bloodletting herself, she is trying to bring life, because there is definitely this connection between the blood and life. But Mot, who is the god of barrenness, doesn't yield to that. When she tries to appeal to him in a humble and gentle manner, he's not moved. He will not release Baal. He's not moved. So instead, she turns around and she literally grinds him up, and basically it sounds like the whole process for turning him not only into wheat but also flour, but also into bread of some kind, and then scatters those remains for the birds to eat. So she takes a god of barrenness who is also associated with death, like death and barrenness equal each other, that should give us a clue about why women who are barren or women who don't bear children are considered, they have a very negative association, because we have this Levantian idea of barrenness as being associated with death. So once again, this idea of the feminine who will not bearing fruit, that's barren, or that's like there's a deadness to it. When it's barren, it's dead. So that association, certainly unconsciously, that may be the association with those who either cannot have children, or those who choose not to have children, or those who are too old to have children because they're menopausal. So there's almost considered to be an evil in that. You saw the widowhood, like Dhumavati in Hindi. There's the Dhumavati is as a widow, as a Mahavidya representing widowhood, that there's a fear of that barren element as well. So it's worth noting here in this context that there's this thing about barrenness. However, this is a warrior goddess who is associated with virginity. Okay, she's a maiden, so she's the girl who could potentially be sexually active, because she definitely has a strong sexual component, but she represents that initial activation of sexuality that has the potential to become something. And this maiden Anath goes into the underworld. Okay, so she actually descends into the underworld and has her negotiation with the death god, which when it doesn't go as she wants, she completely destroys the death god. But what it really seems like she's doing is it's almost like she's turning he's into something, into some kind of a meal or something that is going to fertilize the earth. So by grinding him up, this is what she does. And so she gets this. So this lays the foundation, or almost the seed, in a way of thinking about it, for Baal's return. And when Baal returns, bringing the life-bringing rain, then that is what fertilizes the ground. But it is the ground-up blood of the death god that is bringing this new life in. And what I find interesting about it is the connection of that to the ancient Earth Mothers and their connection to bloodshed, castration, and sacrifice. Okay, it's said that when Anath is arguing with Mot, or when she takes his red staff and she breaks it in half, which is a castration symbol, and this act of both castrating and destroying the male in order to bring life, it seems to be connected to what we see in these ancient mother cults. I've said time and time again that ancient mother goddess cults are not about sweet, loving, protective grandmas who are baking cookies or whatever. This is not the image of the ancient Earth Mother. The ancient Earth Mother not really in a lot of ways could be an Earth Mother, because she has that kind of ghastly reputation. If you think about the cults of the Earth Mothers, Qibli and other similar related cults to her in that area, there was always castration associated with her priesthood. Okay, with the Gali, which is the priesthood of Qibli, they castrated themselves. So this particular act seems to be connected to this idea, what we see represented in this mythology of Anath, the warrior goddess, the virgin warrior goddess, the maiden, attacking the god of barrenness, and then therefore producing the right conditions for things to grow again, for birth to take place, for rebirth to take place, and therefore for life to flourish. So she's the virgin goddess who is laying the foundations through this bloody destruction of the death god, which I think is why they're saying there's this idea that those who were sacrificed to the Earth Mother are like the dying gods who are sacrificed so that the earth may continue, because they're providing blood to the earth, and the assumption is, of course, that blood is what is where life comes from. So you need to shed blood to have this reoccurrence of life. And it reminds me of an assignment that my religion students have quite recently. They had them read a bit on the myth of Shiva and Kirtimukha. And this myth has to do with a demon called, I forget the name of the demon now actually, but this particular demon comes to Shiva and basically has come to steal Parvati, wants his wife. And Shiva responds to him in Shiva's usual fashion by creating this monstrous being called Kirtimukha. Looks like a chimeric kind of a being, but kind of has a lion-type head and this terrifying body. And the sole purpose of the creation of this being is to devour this other demon, who then immediately throws himself on Shiva's mercy. And Shiva, again being Shiva, will then says, "Okay, I'll be merciful to you. I won't have meet you." And so then the being that was just created, he's like, "Well, you created me to eat this guy, and now you don't want me to eat him, so what am I supposed to eat now? What am I supposed to do?" And Shiva thinks about it a moment, and he says, "Eat yourself." So the monster starts with its feet, puts it in his mouth, and basically just goes around and ends up devouring its entire body until nothing but its shining face is left. And Shiva is so impressed by this that he takes the shining face of Kirtimukha and places it over his temple. And so I say to my students, okay, what do you make of this myth? What do you think this is saying about life? And they frequently be like, well, they'll try to equate it with something a lot more modern, like consumerism or capitalism or devouring. I'm like, well, no. This is about the way that life feeds on life. In order for things to live, and all creation mythology, in my view, is about this. It's about trying to understand why death is required to sustain life, because something has to die in order for you to continue to exist. People will say, well, those are people who are vegetarians will say, well, I don't kill animals, so therefore I don't kill. Well, yes, you do, because you kill plants. Plants are also living things. They grow. They live. They have to be nurtured, and they grow in the same, they don't have the same kind of consciousness that we see in animals. We tend to think of animals in a little bit more of an anthropomorphic way, perhaps because they have eyes and a face and they can look at us, which plants don't. So we don't feel the same way about plants. We tend to see plants as just objects, whereas animals, we may have a little bit more of an empathy with an animal and not want to harm it, or maybe sense more of a personality in an animal. So, but nonetheless, the bottom line is life has to feed on itself. And that's kind of the terror and the wonder of life, is that it feeds on itself. And I feel like this particular mythology harkens back to that. You have these different roles here. You have Baal, who is as the bringer of storms and rain, has an important role in this region as a fertility god, with a virgin goddess who battles death and grinds death up into that state of decay, which, think about that also. The idea is that when something decays and rots, it becomes like a fertilizer for the earth that brings things back to life again. So she's using the actual death god himself as this representation of death, decay, barrenness. With his barrenness, actually becomes a source of fertility and is sort of laid as the seed or the fertilizer to allow the rains to repopulate and regrow. So interesting role here of the war goddess, who through her violent act and through this bloodshed and destruction actually brings about the new life in that respect. So something to think about actually with all of the earth mothers and all of the dark goddesses that are associated particularly with destruction, because that act of destruction is actually a fertile act in its own way, or at least participates in the process of fertilization. And we can think about that in the literal agricultural sense, but we can also think about this more broadly in the cycle of life-death, and the importance that these forces, these natural forces, are going to have on the survival of the people who are there. Okay, that's it for me for this week. Thank you so much for listening. As I mentioned at the beginning of my episode, I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Chthonia. Would love it if you would join us. I do offer extra podcasts. I have a different Fiction Friday from the one that I do on Instagram, where on Instagram I read from my published fiction. On Patreon, I read from my unpublished fiction. And I also provide other perks and benefits, all different kinds of merch and things that automatically go to subscribers. So definitely check out that page. You can check me out on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter and Instagram, and 2 words on Facebook. It's just Chthonia channel on YouTube, although now it does seem to come up as Chthonia Podcast, one word. And for my general website with all of my stuff, including my publications, the whole information on the Chthonia concept, and the complete podcast list, you can go to chthonia.net. Thanks very much for listening, and until next episode.